So you probably remember Donald Trump's trade policy, right? From the outside, it looked, well, pretty chaotic. But what if there was actually a coherent three-part playbook behind it all? Today, we're going to dig into an analysis from economist Jose Luis Cava that suggests there was a surprisingly deliberate strategy. And the big question we're going to explore is, was the plan itself kind of brilliant, but the execution a total disaster? Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the two huge problems the White House was trying to fix. Then, we'll unpack their three-pronged plan, see how it actually played out in the real world, and check the numbers. And finally, we'll get to the most controversial part, the big gamble with the Federal Reserve, before we land on a final verdict. All right, so to get this, you first have to understand the diagnosis. According to the administration, the U.S. economy wasn't just facing one problem. It was staring down two massive, interconnected threats that they saw as completely 100% unsustainable. So on one side, you had this ballooning trade deficit, which they blamed on China's export machine, basically colonizing American markets. And on the other side, an equally scary fiscal deficit. The government was just spending way, way more than it was bringing in. The core idea was that these two problems were linked. You couldn't fix one without going after the other. So that brings us to the plan itself. And according to Cava's analysis, this wasn't just some simple trade war. No, it was a pretty sophisticated financial strategy that he says, at least on paper, was an impeccable idea. It was really a three-part play. First, you use tariffs to slow down China and protect your own industries. Simple enough. Second, you take all that money you're collecting from the tariffs and use it to start paying down that massive fiscal deficit. And then, step three, and this is the really audacious part, you use the economic chaos you've created to pressure the Federal Reserve into lowering interest rates, which makes your national debt way cheaper. See? It's one policy designed to hit three birds with one stone. Okay, so the plan on paper, pretty neat. But how is it actually executed? This is where the analysis argues that the whole impeccable idea just completely slammed into a chaotic and disorganized reality. And this quote just nails the critique. Instead of careful, delicate negotiations, the policy was applied with hammer blows. There was no talking it out with allies, just unilateral moves that the source calls flat out a disaster of an organization. Now, this is fascinating. A huge part of the chaos came from just twisting the meaning of economic terms. The administration kept talking about a reciprocal tariff. Normally, that just means, you tax us, we tax you, tit for tat. But they redefined it to mean a one-sided tariff, designed to force a trade deficit down to zero. This created so much confusion and, as the analysis puts it, was a torturous use of the term that just alienated everybody. And it wasn't just the weird language. The whole thing was just slammed by critics. They said it was brutal, arrogant, and totally inconsistent, slapping tariffs on allies and rivals seemingly at random. The general consensus was that this is exactly the kind of thing the World Trade Organization was built for, but it was just completely ignored. But okay, for all the chaos, did the basic math even work? Could the tariffs actually make a dent in that massive fiscal deficit? Let's run the numbers. So first, here's the size of the hole they were trying to fill. A staggering $1.5 trillion annual deficit. Just wow. The tariffs, in the best-case scenario, were projected to bring in about $500 billion in new money. So you do the math. You're still left with a $1 trillion hole. The tariffs helped for sure, but they were never going to be a silver bullet. And that meant the third part of the plan, well, it wasn't just an idea anymore. It became absolutely critical. With that $1 trillion gap still staring them in the face, the administration's focus had to shift to the final and, let's be honest, the most controversial part of the whole plan, forcing the hand of the U.S. Federal Reserve. The logic was actually pretty simple. If you can't raise enough new cash, you've got to cut your spending. And one of the biggest bills the government pays is the interest on its massive debt. So by pressuring the Fed to lower interest rates, the White House was hoping to slash those debt payments and start chipping away at that leftover trillion-dollar deficit. But here is a fascinating twist in this whole analysis. It turns out the Fed was making its decisions based on bad data. The job growth numbers they were looking at were later revised down by almost 1 million jobs. To put that in perspective, that's like the entire labor force of Philadelphia just vanishing from the data. This suggests the Fed probably should have lowered rates anyway, completely separate from any political pressure.
So, after all that, the problem, the strategy, the messy execution, and the results, what's the final verdict on this whole economic experiment?
And it really comes down to this core tension. The diagnosis, the idea that global trade was unbalanced and government spending was out of control, a lot of economists would actually agree with that. But the prescription, the way they went about fixing it with a unilateral, violent, and arrogant approach, is widely seen as a complete failure that damaged relationships and weakened international systems. So, while this specific policy is in the past, it leaves us with this huge, unresolved question. Was this just a one off? Or does this signal a new future where major world powers decide they can just skip the negotiating table and use brute force to reshape the global economy however they want? That's the much bigger idea to chew on.